Palestinian response. And I do it in a very brief way. I found a document that Nabil Qassis, who was until recently the president of Birzeit University, had given me. It was published in 1919 in New York by a group of Palestinian academics and professionals called the Reconstruction of Palestine, published by the Palestinian Anti-Zionist Society in New York City at the time. It included classic historians like Philippe Hetty and others, and Khalil Totah, who had, one of his descendants had given the manuscript to somebody, and they had it in their library in Ramallah, and they discovered it, and Nabil Qassis got a copy, and he gave it to me. But it's a phenomenal document. But the centerpiece of that document that appeared in 1919 was the manner in which we, the Palestinians, had to counter the process of Zionist settlement in Palestine. But after that, Palestinian historiography became involved in something totally different. I mean, they almost forgot about this process of having to fight against this very intrusive process of settler colonialism that was invading and changing their life completely. What emerged as Palestinian nationalism and the way it was articulated, I discovered some fascinating things about this. The Palestinian nationalism that came about was appropriated by the urban notables in Palestine, in cities like Haifa and Jaffa and Jerusalem, but mostly in cities like Haifa and Jaffa. Urban notables, the elite. Here is how one Palestinian historian describes this elite. He says, Palestinian politics was appropriated by the urban notables, and factionalism was the single most important characteristic of this period. Another is that the urban notables, eager to protect their class privileges, worked hard to exclude independent groups, intellectuals, professionals, and new entrepreneurs, and the peasantry. A third conclusion is that the urban notables, instead of working on mobilizing their own people, opted instead to enlist the support of the various Arab governments and the British colonial authorities in an attempt to thwart the designs of Zionist settler colonialists. And two patterns quickly emerged. Palestinian politics began to be tossed around like a football in the arena of Arab politics, and although entreaties to the colonial masters never yielded any results, the pattern simply began to shift towards seeking salvation from other international powers. So if Britain is out, then we look to America and so on, and with the United Nations, or the more contemporary refrain that we now hear appealing to international legitimacy or the international community. There's an incident that is very interesting that I found that encapsulates all of this and encapsulates the contradictions, and I think, in my opinion, defines a script that emerged during the Mandate period in the 1930s and remained characteristic of Palestinian politics throughout the whole period until today. The incident involves a sheikh, the well-known Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam, who was born in Syria, and eventually, having served in the Ottoman army and so on, and he went to Libya to fight against the Italian colonists, and he was condemned to death, and and then he came back to fight against the French occupation of Syria and the Mandate, and he was condemned to death, and he escaped, and he eventually ended up in Haifa, where he became imam of a very important mosque in Haifa. And this sheikh young, energetic, very charismatic, would go around the countryside organizing and mobilizing young people. And he succeeded in mobilizing quite a few of them, hundreds and thousands of them. The story I found, the reference to the story, comes from the memoirs that Walid Khalidi, Professor Walid Khalidi of the Institute of Palestine Studies, recently, in the last couple of years, put out with a long forward of the memoirs of an activist in Haifa called Rashid Hajj Ibrahim, who had left, as others, after Haifa fell and ended up in Amman, and he wrote his memoirs in Amman before he died. So these are the memoirs, and they are absolutely remarkable memoirs because they're not the typical memoirs of an Arab fighter. They are straightforward, they're factual, they're very, very objective. There's no attempt to embellish or lie or justify. He just spoke about the events as he saw them exactly. And Rashid Hajj Ibrahim was very friendly to the Sheikh. To make a long story short, the Sheikh eventually declares an armed uprising against the British and the Zionists. And eventually he's killed in a battle. The British airplane spotted him and his followers, and they surrounded them, and there was a battle, and he fell, along with two of his comrades. Now, at the same time, there was the association that he established. There was a parallel association to it, but it was an association that was controlled by the notables. It was the Muslim association that was controlled by the notables. So they had a funeral for the Sheikh and his fallen comrades. Of course, as happens when a hero falls, everybody wants to claim him to appropriate the symbol. So the urban notables arranged for a ceremony to honor the fallen fighter. And some 400 people showed up. Rashid Hajj Ibrahim and his friends arranged for another ceremony, a parallel ceremony, to honor the fallen heroes. And this was for the people, for the masses of people, for the young men that he had mobilized and who had joined his efforts and so on. And some 10,000 people showed up. So 400 people show up for the official ceremony, and some 10,000 people show up. More than 100,000 people showed up 2 days later for his funeral. And the British tried to subvert it and to sabotage it and to try to take control of the bodies and put them in a car so that they wouldn't have riots and so on. And there were scuffles and so on that happened, but they were not able to do it. That's it? Okay. All right. There was a script. The script was very clear. There's a Palestinian nationalism, which is articulated by the urban notables. And by the way, the situation, with all due respect to my comrades in the PLO for many years, and giving them full credit for having raised the banner of Palestinian identity for so many years when it was not, when it was ignored and submerged. And nonetheless, they pursued the same style, the same script. So the script consisted of a nationalism of the notables, of the elite, that really was totally at variance with what the ordinary people in the villages, or the peasants, or those who had lost their land because of Zionist settlement and ended up living in the slums of Haifa and Jaffa and so on, and urban workers were unrepresented. The same script remained until today. It remains until today. You find the exact same arguments today as you did back in the 20s and 30s. You find the same people arguing that the Sheikh engaged in armed resistance. Well, he's making life difficult for us with the Arab governments. He's making it difficult for us to work with the British, to get the British to change their policy. and then he is prematurely trying to target Zionist settlements and for making them respond viciously to us and aggressively to us and so on. The same arguments you find today, the exact same things. I show how Rashid Khalidi, my friend and colleague, deals with that issue of Sheikh Aziz al-Qassam in his book on Palestinian identity. Same way. He made amends for it later on in a more recent book called The Iron Cage, where he talked a little bit more about rivalries and factionalism and so on and so forth. But you know, by and large, it's the same script at the level of academic discourse, and the same script at the level of political discourse. And in my opinion, with the death of Arafat locked up in his little room in the Muqata'a, represented the death of that brand of Palestinian nationalism. That was finished. Today, we don't have any Palestinian discourse, Palestinian political discourse of either kind, whether it's Ramallah or in the grotesque circus in Ramallah or in Gaza. Neither of them really articulate a political discourse that represents the will of the majority of Palestinians. So in my opinion, it's foolish to look for that discourse among those people. So I tried to find it somewhere else. Where do I find it? And I also find that both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, have reached a dead end politically. They've reached a dead end in the sense that, on the one hand, the Palestinian national project has failed. On the other hand, the Zionist project has also failed. But the question is, where do we go from here? Now, what I do is, in the second part, which is actually the most important part of the paper, and this is something I do in this part of the paper that I've never done before, and that is, I'm inspired by the work of some younger historians, Palestinian historians, who are doing history from the bottom up rather than history from the top down, people like Shara Doumani and others. But I'm inspired by the distinction that Partha Chatterjee makes, for example, in his analysis of anti-colonial nationalism between the material domain of the outside and the spiritual inner domain, where cultural identity begins to be formed long before it begins to do battle with imperial power. In the inner domain, he says, the nation is already sovereign even when the state is in the hands of the colonial power. And it is this inner domain that has remained outside the purview of most scholars who have written about Palestinian nationalism. This is as true of scholars who are attached to the Zionist project as it is for those who may be sympathetic to Palestinian aspirations. And then I rely also upon the distinctions that Stuart Hall makes, very important distinctions. I won't go into that. But as a result of all of this, and a rereading of Stuart Hall and a rereading of Edward Said and others, I do an analysis of a young generation of poetry, Mahmoud Darwish, art, a number of artists, film, a number of filmmakers, and I argue that in that inner domain, the Palestinians, if you want to know what makes them tick, and if you want to see how they're reinventing themselves, reinventing an identity that goes way beyond cultural borders, it goes way beyond checkpoints and walls, separation walls, and so on and so forth. When you see artists from the Galilee, from Nazareth, from the West Bank, from Jordan, from the US, Palestinian artists exhibiting their work, when you see the work of filmmakers and so on, you see something totally different. Something that not only that cuts across borders, but something that has reinvented the Palestinian story in a totally new way. In such a way to speak about human things in a totally different way from the past, to speak about issues of justice. So that Palestinian film festivals now attract thousands of people, and they are covered by the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and so on and so forth. More so in Europe than in the US, but still, even in the US. Palestinian films now, you can get Palestinian films, some Palestinian films, you can rent them at Blockbuster Video and see them. You can see Paradise Now, it talks about suicide bombers. Much better, more informative than the discussion we heard this morning about what is it that makes these people do what they do. An excellent film. You can get it on Blockbuster Video and rent it and see it. So people now are listening and looking at the Palestinian story from a totally different perspective. And the ruptures that they talk about, that Darwish talks about in his poetry, that Mona Hatoum, in my opinion, one of our most brilliant artists who lives in London and commutes back and forth, and many others that I list here, that work is absolutely mind-boggling. Let me just read you, and I'm taking too long here, but let me just read you the conclusion because I think it's important. I can find no better way to sum up all of this than by quoting from Homi Bhabha's brilliant work, The Location of Culture. And this is a tribute to Adam's comments this morning, which I found wonderful. This is from The Location of Culture. The vernacular cosmopolitan takes the view that the commitment to a right to difference in equality as a process of constituting emergent groups and affiliations has less to do with the affirmation or authentication of origins and identities and more to do with political practices and ethical choices. Minoritarian affiliations or solidarities arise in response to the failures and limits of democratic representation, creating new modes of agency, new strategies of recognition, and new forms of political and symbolic representation. Some things are now clear. The old projects, predicated on the idea, capital I, of the nation for which many people gave their lives over the years, have reached a historic dead end. This is as true of the Zionist project as it is of the so-called Palestinian national movement. The first has clearly morphed into an ugly apartheid system, while the latter has become a grotesque show in Ramallah. What is now being demanded is a commitment to the right to difference in equality as an antidote to the politics of exclusion. Where do we go from here? The Palestinians have been the victims of a fierce assault predicated on the logic of their removal. This is, after all, the logic of settler colonialism, no matter what ethnic coloration it assumes. So most of them have been sent into exile, and yet enough of them stayed on, clinging to every inch of their historic patrimony. Dispersed, fragmented, and disconnected as they now are, they nonetheless are capable of moving beyond borders, over checkpoints, and through their ghettos to connect with each other and with the rest of the world. Their ultimate removal, or barring this, their ultimate subjugation, is no longer possible. Even in the midst of their biggest agony, as they are besieged by Israel's superior force, they continue to foment, to produce works of art, literature, music, and cinema that send a clear and unambiguous message of humanism to the world. In the words of Mahmoud Darwish, that they will be here, immortally here, wanting simply to be. Absent from the new sensibility that characterizes Palestine's young artists are symptoms of anger, despair, and revenge. What they project is nothing less than radical hope, meaning that at the end, they and those Jews who may be touched by their message share the same destiny and therefore must forge a common future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mokhabi. I think that was was a very informative lecture. And I would like to now invite Dr. Avi Shleim. Dr. Avi Shleim is a fellow and subwarden of St. Anthony's College, based at that college's Middle East Centre, and a professor of international relations at the University of Oxford. Between 2007 and 2008, he was the director of the Middle East Centre. And Professor Shleim was born in Baghdad in 1945 and grew up in Israel. Professor Shleim's main research interest is the Arab-Israeli conflict, and he has published a number of books and publications on this subject. Thank you for coming all the way here to share some of your ideas with us.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to come to this conference. I'm very happy to be here. The title of my talk is Zionism, the Founding Fathers and the Palestine Arabs. And there is a printed paper which is quite detailed, which is available for collection for those of you who have a deep interest in the subject. But since I've committed my thoughts to paper, I thought I could take the liberty of speaking more informally to you in the half hour or so that was allocated to me, not to summarize my paper, but to highlight some of the major themes that emerge out of the paper. And I would like to begin on a personal note in order to tell you where I'm coming from, because Zionism is a European phenomenon, and I am a child of the East. I was born in Baghdad to a Jewish family in 1945, and in 1950 my family moved to Israel, so I grew up in Israel. Like many Jews in the Arab world, we were quite happy in our native land. We were well integrated. The Jewish community was large and prosperous and well integrated in Iraq. We spoke Arabic. My parents' music was Arabic music, and there was very little sympathy among the Iraqi Jews for Zionism, which was an alien ideology. But the 1948 war happened. There was a backlash against the Jews in Iraq and the rest of the Arab world, and we found ourselves in a new country. I was 5 years old. It was easy for me to adjust. My father was 50 years old. He never found his feet in the new country. He was truly traumatized, and he never recovered from this upheaval. And he had never been a Zionist. He never complained. In fact, he hardly said anything. But sometimes he would say with a sigh, the Jews prayed for a state of their own for 2,000 years, and they prayed in vain. Did it have to happen in my lifetime? So clearly, the main victims of the Zionist movement were the Palestine Arabs. But it's often forgotten or overlooked that there were other victims, a more minor victim, and that is the Jews, Jewish civilization, Jewish culture in the Arab world. My family and I were not refugees. We were not mistreated. We were not expelled from Iraq. But in a very true sense, we are victims of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Zionism in origins and in essence is an intensely nationalist ideology, a nationalist movement, and an intensely secular movement. It was not a religious movement. It wasn't a Jewish revival. In fact, Orthodox Jews were hostile and remain hostile to Zionism. So from the beginning, it was a secular national movement. the 19th century French philosopher Ernest Renan is said to have defined a nation as a group of people united by hatred of their neighbors and a mistaken view of their past. He didn't actually say that, but he did say that getting its history wrong is part of being a nation. And this is as true of Zionism as it is true of any other people. They get their history wrong, and that's part of Zionist nationalism. The Zionist narrative of the emergence of Israel is a nationalist narrative. And the definition of, by definition, a nationalist version of history is selective and simplistic and self-serving. And the Zionist version of the birth of Israel is no different. So there is a standard Zionist version of the emergence of Israel, if you wish, old history. I belong to a small group of Israeli scholars. Collectively, we are known as the New Historians, or the Revisionist Israeli Historians. The group included Ilan Pape, who unfortunately wasn't able to come to this conference, and Benny Morris. But Benny Morris, during the Second Intifada, has veered to the extreme right, and he's no longer a new historian, in the sense that we are called new historians because we challenge the traditional Zionist version of the course and the causes and the course of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Our initial works of new history came out in the late 1980s, and they constituted a frontal attack on all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war. And in subsequent years, we developed our revisionist critique of Israeli policy from 1948 onwards. To return to Zionism, Zionism was a European ideology which developed in the late 19th century in Europe, the home of nationalism. And part of European nationalism was also hostility towards the Jews. There was an upsurge of anti-Semitism in Europe towards the end of the 19th century. And this upsurge of anti-Semitism gave the prompt, the stimulus to the development of the Zionist idea. So nationalism was the source of the problem, the source of the Jewish problem, because in every European country, the Jews were a minority. But nationalism also suggested a solution to the Jewish problem, which is to create, for the Jews to create a state of their own in which there will not be a minority, but there will be the majority. Every people naturally wants to have a state of its own, independence, political independence. The Jews are a people. The Oxford philosopher, Jewish philosopher Isaiah Berlin used like to say, the Jews are like any other people, only more so. Every people wants to have a state of their own, and so do the Jews, only more so. Throughout its history, Zionism has been a very controversial movement. It commanded the passionate and ardent support of its followers, but it evoked equally passionate opposition and resentment on the part of its opponents and on the part of its victims. And there have been echoes of these very strong feelings about Zionism and its consequences for the local Arabs. There is a recent book by Shlomo Sand, who was also going to participate in this conference but was unable to come from Israel. He's a professor of history at Tel Aviv University, and his book is called The Invention of the Jewish People. And he challenges the traditional Zionist version of the exile of the Jews and the return, and the resurgence of Jewish nationalism, the return of the Jews into history after 2,000 years of the diaspora. I'm not going to go into details about this book, but I just want to suggest to you that the title itself is very revealing, The Invention of the Jewish People, because it's very striking how often we say, how often we use the term to forge a nation. It's because most nations are forgeries. And the Jewish people is an invention, according to Shlomo Sand. There is another American Jewish historian called Salo Baron, who coined the phrase, the lachrymose version of Jewish history. The lachrymose version of Jewish history portrays Jewish history as a never-ending cycle of suffering, of trials and tribulations, of discrimination, of anguish, culminating in the Holocaust. And I accept this as a valid version of Jewish history until 1948, until the State of Israel was established. But I reject the lachrymose version of Jewish history for the period since 1948, because in 1948, the Jews were the victors and the Palestinians clearly were the victims. So the lachrymose version is no longer holds as an account of this conflict. The problem for the proponents of Zionism at the end of the 19th century was that the land of their aspirations, Palestine, was already inhabited by another people. And there is a story about Theodor Herzl, that the visionary of the Jewish state, and Ronnie is already smiling because he knows the story. He was the visionary of the Jewish state. He proposed the Jewish state in Palestine. And the rabbis of Vienna got together and they funded a trip, a fact-finding mission. They selected 2 rabbis, 2 of their numbers. They sent them to Palestine to report on this project. And they sent, the 2 rabbis visited the country, and they sent a telegram which became famous. And the telegram said, "The bride is beautiful, but she's already married to another man." Part of the problem, or one of the reasons for the controversy which surrounds Zionism, is that there are 2 sides to Zionism, 2 aspects. Like the Greek god Janus, Zionism faced simultaneously in 2 directions. There is a Zionist case. The Zionist case is familiar to you. It says that the Jews have suffered everywhere. Palestine was their biblical homeland, their ancestral homeland. They wanted to return to their ancestral homeland. They didn't mean any harm to anyone. They didn't want to dispossess anyone. They just wanted to develop the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. But juxtaposed against the Jewish case, the Zionist narrative, there is the Palestinian narrative, which Fuad Mughrabi has very eloquently summarized for us. And the Palestinian narrative says that Palestine is a Palestinian patrimony. The Zionists are colonial settlers, and they came to dispossess, and they did dispossess, the local Palestinians. So they are responsible for the Nakba, for the dispossession of the Palestinians. And the Nakba is not a discrete event that happened in 1948. It's an ongoing process. It's going on right now, even as we speak, especially in East Jerusalem. The classic statement of the Palestinian narrative was by George Antonius. It's called The Arab Awakening, and it details all the betrayals of the Palestine Arabs by the colonial powers, all the conflicting promises that Britain made to Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, then the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and finally the Balfour Declaration. And Ilan Pape, and it's pity he's not here, also has a similar perspective. He sees Zionism as a quintessentially colonial movement and nothing else, just an extension of European colonialism as a settler state. Zionism, in its own terms, was a huge success story. By 1948, the movement had achieved its principal aim, which is the establishment of an independent Jewish state in Palestine. Zionism had also been extremely successful in the battle for the hearts and minds of men. Zionism is, in fact, the second greatest PR success story of the 20th century, after the Beatles. The main obstacle from the beginning to the realization of the Zionist project was Arab resistance. So from the beginning, the founding fathers of Israel gave much thought to what they euphemistically called the Arab problem. The conventional view is that Zionism and its principal political progeny, the State of Israel, are the innocent victims of Arab aggression and Palestinian hostility. What this overlooks, this version, is that violence was implicit in Zionism from the beginning. So they were not the innocent victims. It was the local Arabs who were the victims of the Zionist movement. And there is a very good book on this subject by David Hurst, who used to be the Guardian correspondent in the Middle East, and he still lives in Beirut. The book is called The Gun and the Olive Branch, The Origins of Violence in the Middle East. And his argument is that it was the Zionists who introduced violence into the region, and Arab violence, however horrendous, however unethical, was just a response to Zionist violence. From the beginning, the Zionist leaders had developed a very clear strategy for dealing with Arab resistance. It's the strategy of dealing with them from a position of unassailable military strength. Or, if you wish, it was a strategy of the Iron Wall. 10 years ago, I published a book called The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World. It covered the first 50 years of statehood from 1948 to 1998. It's a very long and detailed history book, but I can summarize it for you in one sentence. And that is that if you look at Israel's position in the confrontation with its Arab neighbors from 1948 onwards, you'll see that Israel was always ready to resort to military force, to disproportionate military force, and reluctant, remarkably reluctant to engage in meaningful political negotiations with its opponents to resolve the conflict between them. So too much force and too little diplomacy. Today, in my paper, I don't want to go over the history of Israel, but to limit myself to the internal debate within the Zionist movement in the pre-independence period, and to concentrate on one aspect of Zionism only, one aspect of the debate, which is how to deal with the local Arabs. In other words, I'm going to deal with not with political history, but with the intellectual foundations of Israeli foreign policy. The thesis that I want to advance is that there was a remarkable convergence between mainstream labor Zionism and right-wing or revisionist Zionism when it came to the Arab question, in inverted commas. To say this is not to deny that there were deep ideological differences on social and economic issues between left and right, nor is it to deny that labor and revisionist Zionists differed on the territorial limits or the territorial aims of Zionism. The revisionist Zionists staked a claim. First of all, they wanted an immediate declaration of state, and also they staked a claim to a Jewish state over the entire British mandate over Palestine, which included not just the whole of Palestine west of the river, but also the east bank of the Jordan River, whereas the labor Zionists, I wouldn't call them minimalists. They were not minimalists, but they were not maximalists either. They accepted the principle of the partition of Palestine west of the Jordan River. Yet, and this is crucial, whatever their views were, they agreed on one thing. They agreed on the strategy. They agreed that because of Arab resistance, a Jewish state could only be created, could only be established by force of arms. The difference between labor and the right wing was that the labor people, the labor founding fathers, were hypocrites. The gap between the noble Zionist ideals of creating a new society, upholding universal values of democracy, freedom, social justice, the gap between the noble ideals and the treatment of the Palestinians on the ground was so huge that they filled it with humbug and hypocrisy. Whereas the people on the right tended to call a spade and to say, this is our country, this belongs to us, we want this country for ourselves, and we will use any means in order to obtain it. So at least they were more honest. The principal architect of the strategy of the Zionist movement came from the Israeli right, not from the labor movement, Jabotinsky. He was the principal architect of the strategy of the Iron Wall. He was an ardent Jewish nationalist. He was a territorial maximalist, and he was also a novelist and a playwright and an intellectual. Because his aim, as I said before, was a Jewish state over the whole of mandatory Palestine, but there were Arabs there, and the question for him was what to do with the Arabs. And he answered this question in an article in 1923, which, under the title, The Iron Wall, We and the Arabs. The underlying logic of this article was that the end justifies the means. The article was divided into two parts, an analysis of the problem and a prescription on how to deal with it. The analysis went as follows. The local Palestinian population are not a rabble, they are a people with a political consciousness. No people in history had ever willingly made room on its land for another people to come and create a state of their own. And therefore it was a foregone conclusion that the Palestinian Arabs would resist the Zionist project. A voluntary agreement between the two sides was unattainable. The only way that the Zionist project could be realized was unilaterally and by military force. Then came the prescription, and the prescription was to build a Jewish state behind an iron wall of Jewish military strength. The Arabs would hit their head against the wall. They would hit their head against the rampart. They would try time and again to defeat the Zionists and to prevent the emergence of a Jewish state until they despaired, until they gave up any hope of defeating the Zionists. And then, and only then, will come the time for negotiations with the Palestine Arabs about the status and rights in Palestine. The Labour Zionists criticized this article for being immoral, for talking not about universal ideals or justice, by talking about the use of military force. So Jabotinsky wrote a second article called On the Morality of the Iron Wall, and he said that his critics were hypocrites, and it's a mitzvah, it's a religious duty to expose their hypocrisy. And he argued that you have to decide before you become a Zionist whether Zionism is a good thing or a bad thing, whether it is a positive ideology or a negative one, whether it has justice on its side or no, it doesn't have justice on its side. You have to decide that before you become a Zionist. And once you have become a Zionist, then it doesn't matter what anyone else says. This is the just cause, and you have to fight for it. So Jabotinsky's strategy had two stages. Stage one was to build the iron wall, and stage two, when it had achieved its purpose, was to negotiate with the local Arabs. And his articles involve, or they include, a sophisticated theory of change. The argument was that first the militants would lead the Palestinians, and as they got nowhere, as they were defeated, gradually the moderates will come to the fore, and then it'll be possible for the Zionists to negotiate with the moderates. Jabotinsky's message was very widely misunderstood, including by his disciples and successors, by Israeli prime ministers from the Likud, notably Benjamin Netanyahu, because for Jabotinsky, the Iron Wall was not an end in itself, it was a means to an end, whereas for many of the cruder Likud leaders, the Iron Wall, military power, was an end in itself. The key element in Jabotinsky's strategy was to turn as quickly as possible Palestine to achieve a Jewish majority in Palestine. And it's the Jewish majority that would justify everything else. The Iron Wall, and in this sense, he wasn't thinking about what Daryl in the earlier session mentioned called minority settler colonialism. He was thinking about the Jews as majority settler colonialism. The Iron Wall was necessary in order to protect the Jews during the process of transformation from a minority into a majority. Thank you. Jabotinsky didn't think of political rights for the Palestinians. He only thought about human rights, equal civil rights, religious rights, but not collective rights, not national rights. And Jabotinsky had a very large following, not just on the right, but also within the labor movement. There was a gradual shift in the labor movement's priorities, especially after the outbreak of the Arab revolt in 1936 to 1939. And the career, nothing illustrates better the shift to the premises and prescriptions of the Iron Wall than the career of David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the State of Israel and its first prime minister. Ben-Gurion and Ze'ev Jabotinsky were bitter political rivals. Ben-Gurion was a socialist leader, but I would argue that socialism was just a veneer. What really mattered, fundamentally, Ben-Gurion was a Jewish nationalist, and nationalism outweighed socialism. For Ben-Gurion, until 1936, Ben-Gurion had always denied that there was an inevitable conflict. He always said our aim should be a harmony and brotherhood and cooperation with the local Arabs and to develop the country for the benefit of all its citizens. But after the outbreak of the Arab revolt, Ben-Gurion changed his mind, or at least changed what he was saying. He had been aware of the inevitability of conflict before that, but he never admitted it. From now on, he said, there is a bitter conflict, there is one country, Palestine, and we both want the same thing. We both want Palestine, and the conflict is inevitable, and it will be settled not by diplomacy, but by military force. So he made the building of the military force of the Yishuv to be the top priority, not socialism, not a new society. Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky also had shared a very common, shared a conception, the same conception of Israel's place in the Middle East. Both regarded Israel not as part of the Middle East. Neither of them wanted to integrate Israel into the region, into the Arab world. Both saw Israel as being part of the West and an outpost of Western imperialism in the Middle East. Jabotinsky described the Jewish state as fulfilling the role of the ramparts for the West against the barbarian hordes, against Eastern barbarism. And Ben-Gurion said that it was only as a result of a geographical accident that Israel found itself in the Middle East. It had nothing in common, no values in common with its neighbors. It was part of Europe, part of the West. So both never envisaged reconciliation with the local Arabs or cooperation. They always envisaged, and they tried to market Israel as a strategic asset for the Western imperial powers in this region. This very brief review of the internal debate within the Zionist movement is very revealing about both the Zionist movement and its true intentions from the beginning, and it's also revealing on the sequel, about the strategies that Israel has employed ever since 1948 in dealing with the Arabs, of downgrading diplomacy, of being reluctant to engage in diplomacy and relying very heavily on military force. So to sum up, the Zionist program from the very start recognized, or the Zionist founding fathers recognized from the start, that conflict with the local Arabs is inevitable and that the use of force was inescapable. The main difference was that the labor Zionists denied that force would be necessary, and the revisionist Zionists admitted that Zionism could only be achieved by military force. Thank you.